Hello, everyone, and good morning, afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to Foreign Policy's second virtual dialogue in collaboration with the Special Competitive Studies Project, or SCSP. It's called Promise Over Peril, Strategies for Effective AI Governance. I'm Rishi Iyengar, FP's Global Technology Reporter, and the topic at hand today has dominated my beat in the past year. We're almost exactly 1 year out from when OpenAI's ChatGPT launched and thrust artificial intelligence into the global consciousness. The technology has progressed at breakneck speed since then and promises to reshape virtually every sector, for better and for worse. AI, of course, has many facets, but in this discussion, we're going to focus on generative AI or Gen AI, the technology behind chatbots like ChatGPT that can be used to generate text, audio, photos, video, and a variety of content on command. Policymakers and regulators around the world are also looking to move quickly to put guardrails around that technology. With President Joe Biden's executive order on AI, the UK AI Safety Summit, the UN Advisory Board on AI, and the European Union's AI Act, just some of the efforts we've seen gain momentum in recent months. But how much regulation is too much? Where do you draw the line? And how do you ensure the technology can be developed safely without stifling innovation in the process? Our speakers today have been involved in many of those advisory and regulatory efforts and are well placed to answer those questions. Before diving in, I'd like to extend a big thanks to SCSP for helping make this event possible. I'd also recommend that you read their report on generative AI that's available on our website and on SCSP's website as well. And of course, I'm sure I'm not the only one with questions. We also want to be sure we can hear from you, our audience, tuned in and watching our live streams on social media. We've reserved a portion of this event for questions from our global audience, and I will ask them on your behalf as and when they come in. Here's how to write to us. If you're watching the live stream on our website, click the button below to submit your questions. Please be sure to tell us your name, your organization, and since we like to highlight our global audience, the location you're writing from. And if you're joining us on social media, you can chime in using the hashtag #PromiseOverPeril. Or you can email us your questions to events@foreignpolicy.com. So let's get started. I'm pleased to begin our program with Dragos Tudorake, a member of the European Parliament and chair of the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the Digital Age. Welcome, Mr. Tudorake, and thank you for joining us.
My apologies, just 30 seconds. 30 seconds, thank you.
All right, while we wait for Mr. Tudorake, let me just go into why we're here. Of course, generative AI has ChatGPT and generative AI have really exploded in the past year, and there's been a lot of hype, but then there has also been a lot of fear about the potential adverse effects of this technology. So what we're hoping to do with the discussion today is talk to some of the stakeholders in the efforts to balance the promise and the peril, and look at how regulators, policymakers are thinking about it, and what role industry plays, and how we can ensure that the technology is developed safely. And with that, welcome, Mr. Tudorake. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and apologies for running a few minutes late, but it's the final stretch, so things are very fluid and constantly moving.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, your presence here is very timely because you're involved in currently, as we speak, in negotiations for the EU AI Act, as you mentioned. So the EU AI Act has been 2 years in the making, and it's in final negotiations right now. And as I understand it, there have been a few hurdles, a few obstacles. Can you talk us through where the negotiations stand and what the road is ahead?
Yeah, maybe one word on the 2 years, because I think this is the visible part of the iceberg. People think that we have only been working on this for 2 years, but I think it's important to know that there has been a lot of work done prior to that, certainly on the part of the Commission preparing this proposal. Work that has started already prior to 2019 with a high-level expert group on AI, but also then a massive consultation process, a white paper back in 2019, 2020 that allowed them to refine options, refine the how, not the if, but the how, before committing pen to paper and putting forward the proposal. And also us as lawmakers on the parliament side, already prior to the legislation coming to us, we established a special committee on AI in the parliament, which I chaired, which allowed us as legislators to educate ourselves already a year and a half before the legislation hit our offices. So again, it's been more or less 4 years in the making. And now to the hurdles. We are literally in the final 100 meters in a way. We have a final political, what I hope to be the final political negotiating round next week on the 6th of December. There's a 50-50 chance that it will be the final one, but we might also need another meeting after that. There are 3 big points which are still open politically, many other smaller technical issues, but those can be easily sorted. The 3 big points are: one, around foundation models and the kind of regime that we build around them. The second one relates to the governance, and it's linked a bit to the first. There aren't many open questions linked to governance, but depending on what we decide to put as obligations, as a governance around foundation models, those responsibilities, those enforcement mechanisms would then also be put into the governance on the European regulators' corner. So that's why the governance chapter is still open, because it depends on foundation models. But politically, there's not a lot at stake there. And then the third one, and equally, let's say, politically charged, is the issue of law enforcement and how much access do we give to law enforcement, in what conditions, with what safeguards, to some of AI technologies that are by themselves intrusive, such as public surveillance and the use of AI algorithms behind live public surveillance, but also issues having to do with emotion recognition, with biometric categorization, with predictive policing. So some of these, again, very intrusive AI tools that, at least in the view of the Parliament, should be restricted because of, again, in our view, the element of proportionality is not there. With the Council having a more securitarian view, saying that for security purposes, the use by law enforcement of some of these tools is necessary. Again, there's a discussion. It's more political than it is technical, whereas the first one on foundation models is both political and technical, because there's first the political question: do we want to regulate foundation models? And then past that is the issue of how, what kind of criteria do you use to differentiate, so on and so forth, which makes it also technically more complex. And as I'm sure everyone in this call would understand and agree, foundation models being such a nascent technology, there are a lot of things that we still don't know about it, about how it works, about its impact, about what makes a foundation model to be a foundation model. So even pinning the definition in the right place is a challenge. So that's pretty much what we have on our plate. You would say quite a lot for one negotiating round, and that is true. But it all depends on how much preparatory work is done before that. We as Parliament have gone through the motion. We are prepared. The Council is readying its mandate as we speak. Today there's a meeting in the Council, and then there's going to be another one at the Ambassador's level on Friday. If on Friday there is some sort of white smoke coming out of the council, in the sense that they will be giving the presidency a mandate to negotiate towards us on the issue of foundation models, then I think that the likelihood of the next week round being the final one is rather high. If on Friday there is no common understanding in the council on how to address foundation models, then next week will not be enough. We will need another round to clarify these points.
Right. And so by foundation models, of course, you're referring to the kind of generative AI models that like ChatGPT, which we spoke about, but there are
Yes.
also models in France and Germany that are part of this, and basically generative models that have multi-purpose and can be used for a variety of different things, which is why regulation is so important. So coming to some of those companies, other than OpenAI, but also the European companies, how do you see the role of industry in these negotiations, and how do you think about preventing the companies from being too close to it, to the point where the companies are effectively dictating how they are regulated, which is what seems to be happening a little bit right now?
Well, I get this question about lobbying a lot these days, particularly in light of what is going on. I think the industry has a crucial role in legislating something that is as technical in nature and as close to the industry as this regulation is. So that's an important point to start in this conversation. I actually think that they play a positive role in informing us as policymakers as to what the reality is, because otherwise we would not know. We will only be guessing or second guessing, and then come up with rules that make no sense for the real world. So I have always, from the moment that we started work in a special committee that I mentioned earlier, with every hearing that I organized in that committee, I always made sure that I have a point of view coming from the industry in every discussion, in every sector possible, from agriculture to space exploration. Why? Because, again, for me, listening to them, listening to their point of view, listening to their arguments is key to make sure that you do the right thing. It doesn't mean that you follow everything they say. And now I come to the second point as to the influence they have. By profession, I'm a judge. And maybe I have this defect as a judge that first of all, I don't rush to a decision, and I never listen only to one side, never, because to every argument, to every situation, there are at least two sides of the story. There are at least two arguments or angles, if not a myriad of angles. And I think that, again, here, if I am to translate the same approach to lawmaking, I think the duty we have as lawmakers, again, particularly when we regulate something as complex as this thing, is to listen to everyone. But then at the end, after you have listened to everyone, after you have filtered all of those arguments through your own processes, then you make a judgment that is yours, that you are responsible for, and then you defend that argument. So I take lobbying just like that. Again, for me, my door has been open, my inbox has been open to everyone that had something to say, that wanted to present their position. I never consider myself influenced by that. I consider myself informed and educated by everything I hear, because again, I make up my own mind, and I'm convinced that my colleagues do the same, as to what is the thing that I want to defend and the thing that represents what ideologically, personally, intellectually, I believe is right. I can't speak for everyone and for what happens outside the walls of this parliament. And to be honest, if I read some of the positions that are coming from the council these days, I do seem to find a strange similarity to, word for word, some of the arguments that I had heard coming from some parts of the industry. So I do ask myself, yes, whether that lobbying has not been effective in some other places. But I leave them to their own devices, and they have their own responsibilities to bear. I am going to continue to defend what I think is right in this negotiation, together with my colleagues, and what I think the Parliament's mandate is. irrespective of the noise that is taking place outside.
Right. And of course, the EU has been a leader and trendsetter for tech regulation globally well before AI. There was the GDPR, which for data privacy. More recently, there's the DSA and DMA, which focus on social media and kind of monopoly power with big tech. Right. And then now there's the AI Act. So what signal do you think it sends to the rest of the world that even in the EU at this last hurdle there are so many obstacles, or the EU is having trouble getting this act passed? What signal does that send to regulators around the world?
I don't think it's necessarily a negative signal. I think it shows how complex. If anyone thought that this is going to be an easy file to negotiate, then I think they were buying the ticket for the wrong movie. I knew, and we all knew, that it's going to be a very, very hard negotiation. Because again, what we're doing, and this also speaks for in a way the effect outside the boundaries of our jurisdiction. We know too well that what we're doing and how we're doing it is going to represent a model, whether it's going to be a model that would be replicated or serve as an inspiration for others or not, that's a different discussion. But still, it's going to set a standard, it's going to set a model that's going to be watched by everybody. So again, this is not something to trifle with. This is not something that you want to rush in one or two meetings and seek and agree with whatever compromise just because you want to get it done. So yes, we take more time than maybe some expected. I take more time maybe than I expected. I actually thought that we could finish by October. But I think we owe clarity, we owe precision, and we owe thoughtfulness in the way we write these rules, and that's precisely what we're doing. And particularly when we deal with something, as I said at the beginning, something as fluid as foundation models is right now. No one has gone past the scratching of the surface, even in terms of setting up some sort of principles or voluntary commitments, whereas we are going down the route of hard law. And again, when you write hard law, speaking now again as a lawyer, as a former judge, particularly in a civil law system like the one we have in Europe, you have to be very precise about your hard law. And again, if that takes a bit more time and hard negotiations, then that's exactly what we're going to do, because we need to get this absolutely right.
Right. Well, we're almost at time, but for my last question, I do want to dig into that idea of wanting to get it right, wanting to be precise. Can you speak a bit to what are the biggest risks of getting the regulation wrong, or what are the risks of not getting this over the line, given that this is such a fluid and fast moving technology?
Well, let's start with the last line of the argument. The risk of not getting it past the line. I think the risk is big. I was asked 2 years ago when we started working, why did I think that this was an important regulation to negotiate and adopt? Because back then there were still many people that were thinking that this discussion is more theoretical. That the risks are more theoretical, or maybe not sufficiently relevant for the broader concerns of society and economy. I would challenge those that were asking that question today to see if they still think that the risks associated to AI development are things that we can ignore, or if those risks are theoretical. Because right now, and I think there's a growing awareness in our societies, which is evident in every opinion poll that you run, both in Europe, the US, and other parts. Society starts understanding what the risks are, and they demand a solution to these risks. And I think they rightly expect that we, as policymakers, take these risks seriously and find solutions and safeguards for them. So I think the risk of not having it would be quite substantial, because the signal that we would send to our citizens and our society is that we either don't care, or we believe that this is something that we just fought over and we couldn't find a deal. And I would just use, because this is a very relevant discussion in Europe, I know that in other corners as well, where we've been fighting for 7 years to find a solution on migration. Why is migration still on the table of every political debate right now in Europe and continuing to divide society? Because we couldn't find a solution at the European level for it. And I would dare guess that the same will happen. And I don't think we can afford for AI to become an ideological debate that would be dividing our societies. And that is why we need to be serious about regulating. And in terms of the risks, well, I think there's a multitude of them. I know that there is a tendency right now to focus on the big existential threats to humankind, and somehow all of the discussions in London and in G7 and many other fora is about the big existential threats. As real as they're not the only ones. So first of all, of course, we have to think of those because they are structural. But there are a lot of the other, let's say, day-to-day risks. When I go to the bank, when I take my kid to school, and he or she gets appraised by an AI system and given a task that is different to the kid next door, is it something that I want to leave completely unchecked, for which I want no transparency, no explainability as to how it works, to know nothing about the data sets that we use to train those algorithms that are determining what my kid does or doesn't do, what I get as a credit when I go to bank, what I get as an insurance rate, and so on and so forth? No, at least in our view, as European lawmakers, we believe that we cannot ignore those risks, and we cannot leave society exposed to that, because ultimately it means that society will not trust this technology. And as we know, this technology is going to underpin literally everything that we're going to have in our economies in the next decade. So I think that this trustworthiness is fundamental for how we build further the inclusion of AI in our lives.
On that note, Dragos Tudorake, thank you so much for joining us today. That's all the time we have, and good luck with the negotiations.
Thank you.
And now for the next portion of this event, we'll be looking to broaden the conversation both geographically and topically with three stellar panelists. I'd now like to welcome them. We have Rama Eluru, who is the Senior Director for Society and Intellectual Property at the Special Competitive Studies Project, Dr. Virginia Dignam, Professor of Responsible Artificial Intelligence at Umeå University in Sweden, and Dr. David Danks, Professor of Data Science and Philosophy at the University of California, San Diego. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to start with a question to all three of you, actually. We've discussed, we saw in the previous discussion, and we've seen that there is a lot of talk about the promise and the peril, the hype and the fear, and there's a lot of things being said, ink being spilled. I'd like to ask each of you what you feel is the biggest misconception right now around AI, either around AI regulation specifically or around the technology more broadly. Rama, we can start with you.
Thank you, Rishi, and thank you to Foreign Policy for partnering with us on this event. I agree with Dragos that one of the biggest misconceptions is that we should be focusing our regulatory efforts solely on existential risks that threaten all of humanity. I think that we do have familiarity with, we know what some of the immediate risks are to, for example, bias and deepfakes, disinformation, fairness, equity, privacy. And we have existing authorities that we can use to address those issues. I mean, that said, existential risks, I think, is something that we should be looking towards and understanding more. Just yesterday, as a matter of fact, the chair of the Competitive Studies Project, Eric Schmidt, said that it's possible within the next 5 to 10 years that artificial intelligence is going to start making decisions for itself. So, and that, that certainly is a big threat to humanity. And so while that is on the horizon and we need to keep an eye towards it, I think we need to also be working on the immediate threats that we're aware of and have the tools to address.
Right. And I'm mindful that we're going into, you mentioned deep fakes and disinformation. We're going into a year where more than 50 elections are happening around the world, and we've seen election disinformation and misinformation before, but the AI has huge implications on those processes as well. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Absolutely. And also with deep fakes and disinformation, it is not just a threat to elections, but for example, it affects, there's been reports recently that it is affecting high school children because kids are using deep fakes to create false images of people and circulating them. And so obviously there's a lot of harm and psychological injury in those cases.
Right. Virginia, I'd love to get your thoughts on the biggest misconception that you feel is out there.
Sure. I actually have two misconceptions I would like to refer to. The first one is the idea that regulation is somehow a hinder to innovation. I think that we really need to understand the role of both. And without regulation, innovation is directless. I think that regulation gives the direction in which we have to go. And moreover, we have to understand that developments in AI are just not the speed on one direction, that the accuracy and the movement forward, but we also need innovation on the guardrails. We need innovation on the regulation. We need innovation on understanding the impact of AI in our world. So regulation can really support that. But maybe the biggest misconception is the idea that AI happens to us, that AI generates big deep fakes, that AI does this, that AI takes this. AI doesn't happen to us. We make AI happen. AI is an artifact. We as people, even when AI takes decisions in our behalf, even when AI is autonomous enough to move forward solely, we do need to understand that all of that is possible by the design, by the purpose that we people put on it. So the big danger is not so much what AI is going to do, but what people are doing with AI. And that I think that is the biggest misconception that we need to. AI is not the weather. AI doesn't happen to us. We make AI happen, and we make the environment in which AI can be dangerous for us.
Right. That's an important point, that it's humans who are developing AI, and we have the power, I guess is what you're saying, to shape the way that AI progresses. I'd like to bring
not only developing AI, but also creating the environments in which development of AI is possible. Also the regulatory and the standard environments around it. So it's not just the technical development, but for a large part the societal environment in which these developments are possible.
Right. David, now I'll put you on the spot with your biggest misconception or misconceptions.
Thanks so much, Rishi. And the problem of going third is that so many of the things that I was going to say were taken by Rama and Virginia. I whole-throatedly endorse the things that they were pointing out. So I guess I'd like to surface something that was perhaps implicit in what both of them were saying that may surprise a number of people in the audience, which is, I think there's a misconception that we don't actually have regulation of AI. People talk about, as Dragos did, the EU AI Act as a thing in the future, and they look at the executive order signed by President Biden and say, well, but that's not regulation. But in fact, a lot of AI already is regulated, because in many countries, the ways that regulations are written is they're written for particular sectors around outcomes, around standards, around performance, independently of the way in which that is achieved. So if we think about the financial sectors, most of the regulations in most countries, it doesn't matter if I use AI or I've got a really smart human or I've got a monkey tapping at a keyboard. What matters is what happens as a result of the transactions. And so I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that AI regulation is already here. The Equal Opportunity Employment Commission here in the United States, which focuses on employment discrimination, basically about a year ago, came out and said, we don't care if you use AI or not in your hiring decisions. What matters is, did you discriminate, whether it's via AI or via a human who happened to be discriminating for some reason? And so I think we need to reshape a lot of the debates around regulation and AI to ask, how can we intelligently use the regulatory powers that are already present in particular sectors? And where, when, and how should we extend regulatory authorities to those many parts of our lives that are not yet subject to regulation? There are a lot of parts in our lives that actually are unregulated, many sectors that don't have much oversight. And there is where I think, to pick up on a theme that several people have mentioned, there is where many of the immediate harms are most likely to occur, is in those spaces that are unregulated. So how can we take steps now to support people, to reduce risk and increase the benefits?
Right. So staying on that idea for a bit, and staying on you, David. How do we think about, there's of course the sector specific regulation that you mentioned, a lot of which already exists. How do we think about then regulating AI as a technology, which I guess is kind of the departure point from where we're already at, as you mentioned, and how is it different to say what we saw with social media regulation, or more broadly kind of competition and big tech?
Well, I think part of the big challenge we have, and this has been exacerbated by the rise of foundation models in the last 12 to 18 months, is that much of the technology that's being built is being built in a way that it could be used for many, many different purposes. So literally exactly the same code can be used for financial decisions, for medical decisions, for creating social media content. And so what we have is a technology that is not, it's not sort of staying put. It's moving around in a way that I think makes regulation very hard, because we don't know in advance what the technology might be used for. And here I think the key is to shift away actually from a focus solely on the technology. I think many people who think and write about these issues talk about the socio-technical system, which is a sort of jargony way of saying the code only matters in as much as it is a part of a network of people and social relations and governmental rules and so forth. And I think that we need to recognize that regulation at the level of the code is not going to work, because the exact same code can be used for good purposes or for evil purposes. And so I guess I want to push back in some ways against the premise of the question, which is, I'm not sure that we should be regulating the technology. We don't regulate internal combustion engines. We regulate what they're used for and what they produce in the way of pollution. We don't regulate lumber. We regulate the ways that it is assembled safely or not in house construction. And I think we need to adopt the same attitude with AI, but recognizing that there's a concentration of power in the hands of a few companies who are producing the lumber, as it were.
Right. Rama, I'd like to bring you in at this point. There's been sort of a few arguments that at the crux of this is not stifling innovation when you're trying to put in these guardrails. So how do governments go about doing that? Where does that kind of balance lie? And we've seen a variety of approaches in the EU. The US has gone for a more voluntary approach, almost self-regulatory. Can you talk a little bit about some of the kind of upsides and downsides of those approaches?
Sure, and it's already been mentioned by Dr. Dignam that regulation and innovation are not mutually exclusive. I will say that unnecessary and overly burdensome regulation does stifle innovation, but effective regulation, on the other hand, actually fuels innovation. As an analogy, let me say that speed limits allow us to drive more effectively while keeping us safe, mostly. And I think that's what regulation can do as well. Regulations and measures that provide trustworthy outcomes and uses of artificial intelligence will allow us to harness the transformative benefits that this technology also has, for example, in healthcare and in education. When the technology works as intended, people are going to use it more. There's going to be wider adoption, which creates new markets, which brings in investment and research. And so that allows more innovation, allows us to have more opportunities from these technologies. And so if we don't get regulation right, or we don't regulate at all, I think it is a critical risk, as Dragos pointed out, that I think we will have some serious harms to society, like privacy violations and bias, and there will be a tech clash. People will not use this technology. And not only will we not be able to, as a United States American society, harness the benefits of this technology, but it also means that the United States risks ceding leadership in this technology to other nations, right? So we may be in a world in which our digital infrastructure and our applications are controlled by other nations, and that it may not be with democratic values, democratic ideals. If we see leadership to another nation, for example, with an authoritarian government, we could be living in a world in which our digital world is, for example, a surveillance state. So I think it's really critical that we have a viable and sustainable democratic model for AI governance.
So Virginia, you've also been involved in a lot of pan-European but also multilateral efforts at the UN and in various other forums. You're on the UN advisory board on AI, which I know is in its early days. But going off of Rama's point, what she mentioned about sort of other countries, and how important is it to create a global dialogue, make this dialogue global, because of course AI is going to impact everyone. It's a borderless technology like a lot of technology is, but how important is it to have global standards, and how do you go about setting and thinking about those global standards?
It is crucial. I mean, like you say, AI is global, so we need to talk about AI regulation, AI standards, AI governance at a global level. That doesn't mean that we all have to do exactly the same thing, to have the same regulation, the same standards. We don't have that for other things. We work perfectly well traveling around from one country to another, even though our electricity sockets are different in every country. So we do need to accept that there will be differences at regional level, at country level, at industrial sector level, but we need to have some global agreements and some global rules of the game. In the discussion so far, we have been talking, and the AI Act in itself, we talk a lot about the regulation of the technology. David already said that we need to be broader than that, and I fully agree. If we go back to the example of the car, let's say the example of road safety, we do need to ensure that the cars that go into the road follow some regulations in terms of the brakes, in terms of the seat belts, and so on. We all know, like Rama says, that we all drive faster because the cars have brakes. None of us would go into a car without brakes, knowing that. But in road safety, car brakes and seat belts are not the only things we need to regulate. We need, for instance, to think about driver's license. We know that people who go into the road have a driver's license, and we can then expect some type of understanding of what we are doing. With AI, anyone can look at a TikTok movie tonight and start a company tomorrow, and that seems to be perfectly fine to work like that. But mostly at a global level, we need to agree on what are the fundamental road safety principles that we all want to adhere to. The principles for AI safety, for inclusion, for participation, for understanding the main values, and those are independent of technology. And regulation needs to be future-proof. I don't think we should be focusing on foundation models at all in the regulation that we are talking about. We know that foundation models are now the standard, but next year there will be something else. And if we focus regulation too much on the current hype or the current development, we are always running behind the technology. We need to make regulation for the future, for what really matters to us, independently of whatever are the technology that we are going to use for. And that is something that we need to discuss globally.
Right. And on that point, I'd like to bring all three of you in, but Virginia, there's a couple of you have used the kind of safety, the seatbelt example. There's also been the analogy of nuclear weapons and the International Atomic Energy Agency. We need something like that for AI. But given the particulars about how AI is developing, how well do those analogies fit directly to AI? In other words, what would brakes and a seatbelt for AI actually look like in practice?
Indeed, the issue of analogies is always dangerous because we stay in the image of what we bring. But on the other hand, it helps the general public to understand what we are talking about. So I think we shouldn't stick too much to the analogies, but we do need to have a global, inclusive discussion about what are the main principles that we want to ensure for in a world where AI is going to be behind a lot of the technology and a lot of the innovation that is going forward. I think that for that we need to start, for instance, by the universal human rights, which we as citizens of the world more or less agree, or most countries agree on these human rights. So let's start from those principles that we agree on and see how we need to ensure that these principles remain crucial and remain central in a world where technology is shifting very quickly.
Right. Rama?
Sure, I'll interject and say that I'll give a concrete example. I think a lot of these governance frameworks call for testing and evaluation before deployment. We have a lot of work to do there. So how we need evidentiary-based understanding of the state of the science. So we need to have tools to be able to evaluate how this technology is going to work, what it can do, what it can't do. And I think that's where we really can bring everybody in to sort of understand the capabilities of these very advanced AI systems. And I think that's where, we can work domestically as well as across borders.
Right. David?
I guess I would also add, especially as we think internationally, I think it's important to recognize and remind ourselves that regulation is not the only form of governance. There are voluntary standards, there are best practices, there are social norms. I mean, if we just, not to go back to it, but to go back to the road safety example, you don't just need to know the laws, you don't just need to be licensed and have a safe car, you also need to know the local driving customs. Even within one country, people drive radically different in Boston versus Pittsburgh versus San Diego, let alone if I were to go to Mumbai or Rome, where the completely different set of social norms around driving. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to move very quickly. I agree with Virginia that we need to be careful in the regulation not to call out specifically things like foundation models, in as much as we even have a clear definition of that, because that won't future-proof the regulations. But social norms and voluntary standards and best practices actually can potentially shift a lot faster. And here, personally, I'm very excited to see what's going to be happening in the coming months, not years, but months, from both the UK AI Safety Institute, where there was the £100 million investment, but also the US AI Safety Institute at NIST, and similar efforts that we're seeing appearing at many different countries around the world, where the focus is not on writing the next round of regulation. It's not on how to write binding standards that we can enforce against companies. but rather it's about what are the practices? How should we be testing and evaluating technologies that can be used in many different ways? Can we have an understanding of what is permissible in terms of what gets released to the public without additional disclosure? I mean, a lot of these systems are just being dumped on the public with no real education or information about what they do or what they're capable of. And so I think if we can move towards those kinds of governance and not solely regulation, we might have a chance of doing something on the international stage.
Right. So
I fully agree, and maybe just adding on what Rama has said, this evaluation and testing of systems is crucial. We do need to understand also what are we testing. These regulations, soft or hard standards or formal laws, call for things like fairness. As a developer of an AI system, how am I going to implement fairness in my code? What does that mean? And moreover, we do need to have ways to verify that whatever I implemented in this code is indeed aligned with what was interpreted as being the interpretation or understood as being the interpretation of fairness. In this is an area in which we really need to have much more innovation, much more research, and it will really be the, let's say, the glue that puts together all the technical developments, the legal regulations, but also all the social and normative and standard type of governance that it's needed. We need to have a much better understanding what do we talk about when we talk about this type of principles.
Rama, you mentioned kind of the idea of sort of ensuring that democratic values are a part of this, and we've gotten this far in the conversation without mentioning China, but I'm going to do that now. AI has, of course, been one of the biggest components of the US-China tech competition that we've seen. How do you see that kind of shaping up? How do you see any potential for the US and China to work together in some areas of AI and AI regulation, and what would that look like?
Great question. The United States and China both stand to gain from two-way communication. Clear communication between the world's two leading military and tech powers is vital for global stability. Communication alleviates miscommunication, misunderstandings that could lead to conflict. Even during the Cold War, for example, the United States and Soviet Union had high-level discussions on issues like non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and smallpox vaccine distribution. And just most recently, President Joe Biden and Xi did get together at a summit to talk about artificial intelligence, or at least that was one of the issues that they discussed, and they discussed the AI risks, and there was an output from that summit. They agreed to continue these discussions about shared risks with AI and increasing safety, government to government. So while that's a modest output, it's still an output. It's better than nothing. And then as another example, the UK invited China to the UKAA Safety Summit. China showed up. There was a Bletchley Declaration signed by China and 27 other countries on identifying risks to AI and continuing those discussions and establishing an AI Safety Summit. So I think clear communications is very important, again, between these two countries, especially when they are tech and geopolitical rivals. But I do think we have to be realistic about these communications, right? I mean, there have been instances where China has used these communication channels, dialogue channels, as leverage on other issues. So I think it's important to have these discussions, and I think the United States historically has kept the lines open for communication. I think the onus is also on Beijing to keep their side open and pick up the phone when we call.
So, David, I wanted to ask the other big bit of recent AI news that we haven't spoken about is the recent turmoil at OpenAI, where their CEO Sam Altman was fired by the board, came back 5 days later with mostly a new board. And my question kind of goes to something that also came up in the earlier discussion, but what does that kind of chaos at what is arguably the biggest AI company at the forefront of developing a lot of this technology, what kind of signal does that send to regulators? What kind of impact will it have? And to the earlier question I asked, how do you think about ensuring that companies aren't too close to the regulation that is meant to keep them in check?
Yeah, so obviously I don't want to go into the details of what has happened over the last week plus, but I think the first lesson to take from those events, though, is I think it has spotlighted the ways in which there are real systemic risks from having just a very few players, where so much of the power is concentrated in just a few companies. I know a number of people were kind of shocked to learn that OpenAI, a company with tens of billions of dollars of valuation, in the news constantly, one of the main players in producing foundation models, though there are of course others, that OpenAI has less than 1,000 employees. I know a lot of people were stunned to learn just how small it is. Now, of course, there are many other people that they're subcontracting to for things like data cleaning and data labeling, but nonetheless, it's a small company. It's a small group of people who are ultimately making decisions that are having enormous far-reaching implications. And I think it should be a little bit of a warning sign that the internal turmoil at one company could potentially change an entire sector. We should get worried when this much power is concentrated in only 2 to 4 companies, depending on sort of how you want to count things. And so that's the first lesson that I would take away, is that I think that we need to be very careful to find ways to perhaps, I hesitate to use this word, but in some sense democratize the ability of people to innovate using technologies that aren't tied to a particular company, whether that be with open source or through national research resources that can help to provide access to the kind of compute that's required. I think the other thing, though, is, as you said, it raises questions about whether our efforts at regulation and governance are going to, be co-opted, whether we'll have a kind of regulatory capture by the technology companies themselves. And here, I think the onus is actually not on the companies, but is on governments. Right now, the technical capacity and technical knowledge in a lot of regulatory agencies is less than optimal, shall we say. And I think that it's really critical for governments to be actively, and many are starting to a little bit late, but actively build their technical capacity so that they aren't asking the wrong questions. They are able to get the information they need about the capabilities of the systems to effectively govern them.
So, Rama, I'll bring you back in on that. There's obviously policymakers, regulators on one side, and companies and industry on the other side. It's maybe not quite that binary as we've seen. They do work together a lot. But what would you say is the thing that in each side gets most wrong about the other? What are the bridges that where do the gaps lie, and what are the bridges that need to be built?
Great question. So I think on the industry side, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that policymakers don't get this technology. I've been working on national security and artificial intelligence since 2019, when I was at the National Security Commission on AI. And I can say that the discussions with policymakers back then compared to now are starkly different. I think members of the Congress and the administration are now on the right side of the learning curve when it comes to this technology. And I think this is reflected in the efforts on the Hill. Senate Leader Schumer's held the AI Insight Forums with leading voices from industry, academia, civil society. And there's a lot of pending bills on the Hill to address AI and how do we govern this technology. The administration issued the AI Bill of Rights, the NIST RMF, recently the executive order, as well as OMB guidance. So I think that policymakers want to govern AI. They want to get it right, and that takes time. And I think on the government side, industry does. I think there's a misunderstanding about what industry wants. I think industry is actually calling for regulation, which is very atypical. I think industry wants to help government get governance right. They want to work with the government to see how they can help. I recently attended the NIST efforts on establishing the Safety Institute. They had a packed house, so with a lot of industry representatives in the auditorium who were volunteering to help. And so I think that's a great sign. I do think as mentioned earlier, I think we need to be realistic about regulatory capture to make sure that policymakers are actually representing the interests of the public and not industry itself. But I think that can be done. I think I think government has to set the agenda. And industry, which obviously currently at least has the expertise and know-how to inform the agenda set by government. A lot of the solutions and recommendations that SCSP and others have put forth that require public-private partnerships. So I think we need to figure out how to get those effective public-private partnerships right.
Right. So we're almost at time, but I started with a question to all three of you, and I'd like to end with one. We started with misconceptions, but at the end, I'd like to ask each of you, what would your one priority, AI governance priority be going forward? If you had to pick one thing that needs to be done immediately, what would that be? And Rama, since you have the mic, we can start with you.
Great. Yeah, I think that we need to start with the risk-based approach. There's a lot of consensus that we need risk-based approaches to balance regulation with innovation. Special Competitive Studies Project in collaboration with Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab just put out a framework call for identifying highly consequential AI use cases and outcomes that regulators can use to see where they should be focusing their regulatory efforts. And it takes into consideration both benefits and harms in parallel, so we can see where on the continuum these AI use cases or classes of use cases fall, to see if this is something that requires regulatory attention. So I would say that's what I would like to see.
David?
I would like to see a recognition of the inevitable dynamic nature of regulation and certification of these systems. Too much of the discourse is centered on, are these safe or not, as opposed to how are we continually evaluating, revising, improving. And I think that sort of mindset shift to focus on the dynamics rather than static choices at a moment in time could really help to broaden people's perspectives on what is possible when we think about AI governance.
Right. Virginia, you get the last word.
Sure. I would like to extend this discussion of the public and private. It's not just about governments and industry. We need to include civil society. We need to include, and that's what I would like to see a much bigger attention and participation of those that are affected by these systems, those that are not seen by these systems, those that are excluded from the discussion. So we do need to create a broader basis for discussion. Industry, governments, and civil society. And this means that then what we really, my next most important, or the most important step that I see is the issue of education. We need to focus much more on ensuring that the public in general, citizens of all levels, have a much better understanding of what AI is, what AI is not, what AI can, what AI cannot. And probably this type of education needs to start with the media. The media is at this moment one of the main channels of generating hypes, generating dystopic views around AI. So including civil society and ensuring that there is a broader understanding and education about AI. Those are the two directions I would like to see going.
Thank you. And on that note, speaking of the media, you can find all of Foreign Policy's coverage on AI from myself and my colleagues on our website, foreignpolicy.com. I'd also recommend you look at SCSP's very comprehensive report on generative AI that digs much deeper into a lot of these issues than we were able to. We spoke for an hour, and it feels like we've still just barely scratched the surface of this issue. So it's, of course, an evolving, important topic that you'll continue to see us cover, and these discussions will be ongoing. So a big thanks again to SCSP for supporting today's event. And please be on the lookout for the third installment in this 6-part series that will be on December 12th. In that, we'll focus on the economics of AI. You can stay tuned for updates on that and other upcoming events at foreignpolicy.com/events. Take care. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and see you soon.